Wonderful. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome my guests today, Dave Schmidt and Julie Fine, and everyone joining today at MassCEC and beyond. This is the sixth edition of this MassCEC speaker series where we highlight experts, pioneers, and practitioners from a variety of existing and emerging climate tech sectors and disciplines, as well as subject matter experts who can provide insights into the broader economic, social, and technological dynamics shaping our industry. Today, we're talking about agriculture in Massachusetts and around the world in the face of a changing climate, how farmers are adapting and how the innovation community is responding. Before I turn to Julie and Dave, I'm going to set the table for our conversation today, as I do each month. For those of you who are wondering, why is the Mass Clean Energy Center interested in highlighting agriculture and ag tech? Well, the agriculture industry contributes about 11% of emissions nationally and about the same percentage globally, if I'm not mistaken. Though far less here in Massachusetts, about 1%. So the emissions relative to the emissions associated with the energy sector, the buildings, and the transportation sector from agriculture are indeed quite modest. Nevertheless, we care deeply about the sector for a variety of reasons. We have an opportunity to demonstrate climate-friendly farming techniques and technologies that can be deployed and scaled elsewhere for far larger impacts on emissions. It's also important to remember that soil management best practices that optimize carbon sequestration can make a significant contribution to the state's greenhouse gas reduction targets. And of course, strengthening and decarbonizing agriculture in Massachusetts helps protect farmland, an important cultural component of our landscape, and strengthen our regional food system. I was actually surprised to learn that Massachusetts farms provide about 4 to 5% of the food we consume here in the Commonwealth. And then finally, with MassCEC's expanded mandate under the recently passed climate bill here in Massachusetts, our efforts can now begin to reach beyond mitigation and into the realms of adaptation and resilience. And we can begin to include agriculture among the many sectors we consider as we think about new materials, technologies, equipment, and modeling approaches necessary to adapt to our changing climate, including farms and farmers, to help them become more resilient to a variety of increased risks to agriculture posed by our changing climate. We may have an extended growing season, thanks to a warming climate, but we're also subject to a lot more severe weather, including extreme rainfall events. And many of you tuning in today may remember the heavy rains in the summer of 2023 that devastated farms across central Massachusetts, leading to massive crop failures. So a bit of housekeeping before we start. Again, for those listening in, feel free to drop questions in the Q&A, and we'll reserve some time at the end of the conversation with Dave and Julie to try and address as many of those questions as we can. And with that, I'm very happy to welcome my guests, again, Dave Schmidt with the Department of Agricultural Resources and Julie Fine with the American Farmland Trust. Thank you both so much, Dave and Julie, for joining me today. I'm really happy to have this conversation with you. So, Dave, why don't we start with you? I think the history is kind of interesting here. I think I remember hearing this first from my dad, actually, and then reading about it, that my understanding is that New England was at one point, let's say many centuries ago, 400 or 500 years ago, nearly covered with forest. And then the land converted to agricultural uses over time. And now much of that land is reverted to forest. Of course, we still have farming, but that cycle has occurred. Is that sound accurate to you? That's my sense of the history of the region and how the land use has changed.
Yeah, I think in that time period, I think that's right. I think there are interesting pieces of artwork that kept by others about those scenes and changes over time as well.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Great. Well, I was wondering if you could share with us, just to kind of level set the conversation, like provide a snapshot for listeners of the farming landscape and industry in Massachusetts? Because I think a lot of people just aren't aware, particularly people who live in urban areas and suburban areas. What's the scale of the agricultural industry in Massachusetts? How many farms are there? What are those farmers growing? And how much land does it occupy?
Yeah, yep. I there is an agricultural census that's put out, and it's what I'll try to do here is just give some high level figures on what the scene is like in Massachusetts without comparison to elsewhere. But it is available, that those finer details. But at a high level, there's roughly 7,000 farms currently in Massachusetts, and on a percentage basis, about 14% of those farms are hay farms, 13% vegetable, 12 horses, fruit, tree, nut, and berry, including cranberry, about 12%, and then greenhouses, farms that are greenhouses primarily, about 12%. So all those are kind of the top areas or types of farms. I should say it's a very diverse mix in the state, which is not necessarily the case across the country. But they're pretty clustered around that level of 14 to 12%. So again, 7,000 farms. And in terms of the area, it's about 500,000 acres of land. And I'll say a little bit more about that later on, but about 20% of that is hay, 16% in fruit, 10% dairy, 10% beef production, and then 10% vegetables. So getting back to your earlier comment about the percentage of food that comes from the state, you can sort of see it in that mix and understand the amount of area it's taking up. Again, 500,000 acres, roughly. It's more like 460,000, I think, according to that last census. And then in terms of economic value, just to kind of complete this snapshot, it's about $600 million of agricultural product that's produced each year per annum. And that's about 1% of the state GDP. And then to just give a further sense of that, roughly 27% of that comes from the nursery sector, 22% from fruit and tree, 20% from veg, 10% from milk. And then just to skip down to the bottom, 6% from hay, which again was the largest amount of area that was taken up by hay. But I'll leave those. Perhaps it's not for sale, perhaps it's for feed, right? For dairy and cattle. So yeah, again, if you want to start asking those questions and pulling it apart, the census is a great place to dive into those details and try to figure out, what's the volume on this particular set of activity in the state. Some really interesting information in there.
Great. So I just did a quick Google search. I wasn't aware of this. So about 5 million acres of land in Mass. So you said 500,000. So about 5% roughly. Yeah, that's interesting. That's I think a bit more than I thought. So thank you for that, Dave. That's a really helpful for us to just basically understand the basics and get a sense of farming in Mass. So Julie, let's turn to you now and kind of get at some of these climate impacts. I mean, I referenced the severe weather. I think a lot of people are aware of that. That's been fairly well covered. I think fortunately, there's been good news coverage of the impacts of extreme weather on farming and farmers in the state. But I'm wondering if you could kind of weigh in on that a little bit and talk about the impacts of climate change on farming, particularly here in Massachusetts, and perhaps more broadly in the Northeast. And what are the kind of threats that farmers are facing? I've certainly heard about pest migration, there are challenges with pollination, right? So on and on and on. I wonder if you could just weigh in on that and educate our listeners about that.
Yeah, well, overall, there are two major themes, water and heat, which I don't think will surprise anyone who lives here in Massachusetts. But I think the cascade of consequences is really hidden. So obviously we have too much water all at once, as you mentioned, flooding, erosion. But what that leads to is, pretty massive nutrient loss. Farmers put fertilizer down and it washes away, becomes unavailable, and they have to sort of re-up that investment, which can be a pretty major cost to farms. It has environmental consequences, obviously, damage to soil structure. And then there's all of the sort of management consequences of too much water. So that's like the impossibility of getting in a field to harvest or to transplant the next round of things, difficulty keeping things weeded or sprayed. And then, on the opposite end of the things, we're also seeing droughts. So like early spring droughts or late fall droughts. Last year we had a lot of farmers who couldn't get a cover crop established in the fall because it was just dry for months. And that's really unheard of around here. So the consequences of that, like not having a cover crop, there are a lot of people who rely on that for feed, for soil health management. And then, this also leads to this large increased demand for irrigation. So there's issues around water sources and then major investments in irrigation infrastructure, which not every farm is planning for or can afford. And then we have all the extreme heat, which we've all lived through the last few days, right? Which is dangerous to humans, dangerous for animals, damages crops, can really increase certain pest problems, although it does oddly decrease a few other pest problems. And then certain crops just are becoming not viable in the seasons that we usually grow them. Lots of growers are giving up, vegetable growers are giving up on broccoli and cauliflower and lettuce that we used to grow all summer long. It's just the extreme heat will just kill those things. And then at the intersection of too much water and too much heat is humidity, which can be a major issue for pathogens and also for human health. And I could go on and on. Wind, pollination, wildfire smoke, and how all of those things interact to really threaten farm viability.
So that, well, first of all, that's terrifying and distressing. But it also, this is a real challenge. And Dave, we didn't get into this, but the kind of economic viability of farms. I mean, my very superficial understanding of farms, at least here in Massachusetts and perhaps nationally, is that many really struggle financially, right? And that they have to kind of figure out ways to maximize production on their land, to grow specialty crops, to kind of make up for other losses. And it's a hard business. It can be a very beautiful business and an important part of family culture and community culture, but it's a really, really hard, it's a hard business. And so to have these multiple threats, that's got to hurt financially. Perhaps I'm just stating the obvious, but I think it's important to underscore for folks that this is not a industry with a lot of economic resilience, and there's very little margin. And these increasing threats from climate change, can really probably cause some farms to shut down entirely, I assume. So Dave, how is the state responding? I remember hearing Governor Healy talking a lot about the fund that was put together to help provide relief to farmers impacted by the flooding. But I guess this is a softball question to you, Dave. So what is what is MDAR doing to help farmers? Maybe you could highlight a program or two. I see a lot of renewables on farms. I like to buy my meat and produce and cheese at Warwick Farm out in Warwick, Mass. Chase Hill Farm in Warwick, Mass. And I see a lot of solar at that farm. And I know that MDAR has helped a lot of farmers look at mostly solar, but perhaps other renewables. I think some anaerobic digestion as well. But yeah, if you could just talk a little bit about how MDAR helps farmers, and perhaps one or two examples.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And to just take a step back to your comments about economic systems and impacts, they're entirely spot on and not a small part of, I think, what's gone on in the last 25 years and the prognosis for the next quarter century as well. I mean, to put some numbers around it, again, going back to that census, about 20% of farmland was lost in a 25-year period. So, from the standpoint of 2022, that's really significant. And what's to do there? Well, there are development pressures. There's the aging workforce. I think it's like just under 60 years old is the average farmer age. And, you think about transitions and what that looks like to the next generation or something else. It's all in that same ball. And I think American Farmland Trust had a document out saying that, looking forward, if nothing changes, another 20% will be lost in roughly that same time frame. So it's certainly another kind of snapshot, right? Looking through the history books, but also trying to get into that crystal ball, what's in the future. And so I think some of the way that the state has responded, and in particular MDAR and digesting all these different systems and impacts, it picks up on those threads as well. And so it's looking at farmland protection, not a small project. And I think roughly, I think maybe 80,000 acres of land are protected. So it's a good chunk of land in protection. And there's a strong partnership on the federal level with funding to do that as well. So I think that's a pretty key program. And then when it comes to climate specifically, there's an umbrella program of climate smart agricultural practices. And within that, the idea, of course, is to focus on ways to build resiliency, but also to mitigate the emissions from farms. But the focus there will be on looking at the energy. So in terms of programs for competitive grants for energy efficiency and renewable energy projects, those are all within CSAP. But even still, some of the things we've been touching on, projects that address sort of under the heading of environment on farms. So improving water use, being stewards of resources, a whole array of climate smart ag practices, building this soil health and adding organic material into the soil to build resiliency for the storms that we've been talking about, the droughts that we've been talking about, in a basic way, helping to manage those extremes of heat and water, all under that heading of the Climate Smart Agricultural Program. Another key.
That's great. I think it sounds like, from my observation too, is that you have some clever marketing people at MDAR, because I saw a program to help you reduce your carbon paw print, which I thought was very cute. I think someone's having fun over there in your marketing division. But that's good. Right, good way to get people more involved in thinking about the carbon emissions associated with agriculture and farms and farming, and help farmers reduce those emissions. That's great. Thanks, Dave. That's a nice overview. So I do want to pivot a bit here and talk a little bit about the tech side of the equation here. And here at the Mass Clean Energy Center, we've funded a good number of ag tech, as we like to call them, startups over the last decade or so, about a dozen. A number of us recently visited Clean Crop in Holyoke, Mass, which is a very interesting ag tech company. So we've seen a lot of plays, a lot of proposals related to soil health and seed and soil manipulation, to electrification of farm equipment, to microdosing of fertilizer and irrigation, to interesting innovative approaches to soil carbon sequestration. As well as, and we won't probably get into this much today, but as well as some ocean-based approaches, so some kelp and seaweed farming innovation. But yeah, I'd love to invite you both to maybe talk about some of the ag tech that you're seeing, and maybe what excites you the most. Maybe one or two examples of either a particular company or just a type of technology. Of course, a lot of what I think we need, at least what I've heard from farming experts, is just kind of more advanced farming techniques. But certainly there are some technologies as well, or some protocols and approaches that can be beneficial and help farmers adapt to a changing climate. So maybe, Julie, we could start with you. If you'd love to just invite you to kind of talk about your favorite ag tech approaches, if you will.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, I would say in some ways it feels like most of those technologies are kind of fundamental, right? They're addressing irrigation or crop protection, like growing in greenhouses, or automated climate controls for those greenhouses, more efficient cooling methods. So it's like, in some ways, talking about it as like technology feels like it doesn't look that fancy in the field, I guess, is sort of what I'm saying. I think a great example is a real need and interest in solar irrigation pumps. Right now, a lot of farmers use these diesel pumps, which, crank through a lot of diesel and pollute significantly. And there are definitely cleaner ways to do that. But they're not as easy to set up as diesel pumps. So they're requires investment and planning to do that. I would say that methane digesters are a really important technology in Massachusetts. Our dairy industry is dwindling, and methane digesters are a way to both increase efficiency, keep nutrients on the farm, and keep methane out of our atmosphere, which is critical. I would say that there's a lot of really basic equipment that would increase conservation practices in Massachusetts, where it's something that farmers might not use every day, but if they had more affordable access to those things, they would adopt these conservation practices. So one example is a no-till seed drill, which helps farmers get cover crops planted quickly and efficiently. Farms that own those seed drills cover crop at a 10-time rate compared to farms who don't. So that's a pretty significant technology as far as I'm concerned. Another thing I've heard dairy farmers talking about is baleage equipment. So baleage is when you're baling hay or corn to keep moisture out in case it's really raining. So you can't dry things as well as you used to. But that kind of equipment is actually really expensive, and dairy farmers in general don't have, $100,000 lying around. So, or they're already really leveraged. So I think that there are a lot of technologies that are really important and being used actively and successfully, and some investments are preventing that. The other two things I just wanted to mention were climate battery greenhouses, which utilize the earth as a thermal storage system, and you have air circulating through pipes buried underneath the greenhouse that either store excess heat during the day and draw that back into the air at night to warm the air. So that's like a carbon neutral technology that I think hasn't been adopted as widely as I'd like to see. And actually, one of the systems, there's this Atmos Greenhouse Systems, which is a company that is a farmer engineer. And so I love to see that kind of thing where farmers are bringing their expertise to the engineering side of it. And then I think it's not exactly a technology, but diversification, I think is a really important thing to mention here in terms of
Crop diversification.
Crop diversification. So
Yeah.
sometimes that might be like making hard cider if you're growing apples, or diversifying markets, or agroforestry, or solar. But I think that utilizing existing technologies to diversify is also essential. I could go on and on here. I might just say two more things. One is that
This is great. This is great.
I do think that when you talk to farmers, the number one climate adaptation that farmers report is investing in soil health, which is a technology, right? So healthy soils are capable of supporting healthy ecosystems, and protecting farms from these climate impacts, and protecting the surrounding environment from consequences as well. So investing in organic matter, as Dave was talking about, using mulch to protect the soil, reducing soil disturbance, which means developing different tillage systems. Anyway, I think that those strategies to invest in soil health are the number one thing that farmers are finding helpful in facing climate change.
Okay, that's really great. We're going to come back to some of those topics in a second, but first I want to invite you, Dave. Is there anything you want to add to that list? Any kind of technologies or approaches or protocols?
Yeah, a lot of my favorites were covered already, so maybe I'll think more about kind of design principles and recognize who my audience is, and say that within a lot of those things, what I really like are those technologies that find quote unquote waste streams and make great use out of them. So whether it's waste heat, or it's all the food scraps with the mass food ban, whatever that ban is, you can't throw food in the trash, right?
The organic waste ban, right?
Thank you. Yeah. The systems like digesters that pull those in, I just think they're exquisitely beautiful in what they're doing, right? Taking waste and turning it into something very useful. And then on the other side, maybe one that's a little bit more conventionally in that space of technology and thinking about innovation. I think it was about a year ago, I was hearing some promising stuff about solar panels, making photovoltaic panels, and some really bombastic claims that if these were put on all of the existing nurseries across whatever it was, the country, such that now we're generating electricity with these little, the PN junctions, but also what passes through is perfectly fine for the plants, right? So some big statements here, but let's run with that assumption. So stuff is already built. We're simply taking the glazing away, putting on these new solar panels. There's enough power generated from that, not just for that sector, but for a massive amount of power use for the country. That's, again, very bombastic, but that kind of innovation, I think, is really interesting. We're not talking about really difficult solutions. Stuff that gets laid onto the existing built environment has, I think, a lot of promise. So things in that vein also kind of excite me, and I think probably would get innovators and policymakers also pretty excited about, hey, here's a solution that isn't super tough to add 17 things into the grinder and come out with something that looks good to everybody.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. That's a good reminder. I remember hearing about this innovation myself, panels that allow a certain amount of the visible light to transmit or to pass through to allow plants to grow, as opposed to agrovoltaics, which we'll get into a bit, which are essentially conventional solar panels that are just mounted, ground mounted, but at a higher height to allow perhaps more shade tolerant crops and in some cases livestock to kind of pass beneath them. Yeah, thanks for that reminder. So I did want to dig into the kind of innovation process, but also some cultural issues. And maybe I'm just thinking about it in the moment here that maybe we could have this quick conversation in the context of no-till, because I think this represents my understanding of it. And I think about the challenges with regard to building decarbonization often, right? There's a technology challenge, but there's also kind of like a cultural challenge, right? How do you get building owners, whether they're very large building owners that have dedicated building managers, to change the way that they think about managing and maintaining and operating a building down to the smallest homeowner? Yes, there's the technology challenge, but there's also a behavioral and kind of cultural challenge. And so is that part of what we're facing here? And perhaps this is a question for both of you, but I'll invite Julie for you to weigh in first, is that there's a need for more kind of peer-to-peer exchange and a cultural shift where farmers, some of whom may be just old-fashioned and resistant to new ways of doing things, but where no-till can provide real benefits. What are the kind of challenges and opportunities to kind of move an industry like that in a direction toward practices that are more appropriate, if you will, and adaptive relative to climate change?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, no-till, it's both a cultural and a technical shift. So there is different equipment required. You can't just use the same equipment you already own. So it does require either shifting over your entire operation to that strategy, which is risky to do all at once, or investing in a whole new set of equipment. You need a no-till seed drill, you need a different type of fertilizer applicator. Like there's almost entirely different equipment. So I think that shift can be really challenging for people. So the idea of finding ways to loan equipment, to share equipment could be something that would ease that transition. It also is a cultural thing. It's like, it's like trying anything new where you're like, oh God, is this going to work? And when your margins are already really thin, I think that's really difficult. So if there are ways that we can find to support farmers while they're making that shift, that's going to help. And I think you're 100% right. That farmer to farmer connection is one of the most effective ways to do that. So, for example, I work with a group of farmers. We have this program that's called Farmer-Led Innovations in Reduced Tillage, which is not no-till, but I'm actually a big fan of just reducing tillage and not eliminating it entirely, because it doesn't work for every crop to do no-till. This is just convening these peer cohorts where people work together for 2 years, they meet in a group and they talk about different strategies they've used and what's been successful and what hasn't been. And that exchange, I think, is really, it's not just a technical exchange, but it's also a lot of just sort of social support and inspiration. Like when listening to a lot of these farmers, they're like, oh yeah, like once I started thinking about this, I was like, oh yeah, I can figure that out. And so I think that is, one of the most important things we can do is to really take advantage of the fact that farmers are experts in their field, right? They're the ones who know the most about it. And if we can get them talking and inspired and sharing their successes, that's critical.
I think you just honed in on a good bumper sticker, Julie. Farmers, experts in their field.
Mm-hmm. I'll work on it.
Sorry, that was awful.
No, I liked it.
Okay. That's good. That's at least one person. So, Dave, do you want to weigh in on that as well? On this notion of kind of no-till, um, but just kind of technology adoption generally.
Yeah.
And it sounds like the state does have a program to help farms and farmers kind of move toward more sustainable practices. But yeah, I'd just love to kind of invite you to react to this thread as well.
Yeah, I think what I could really do is just amplify what Julie had already touched on, and that, and maybe to make a soundbite out of it, maybe there's a culture that we don't want to change, but need to just sort of understand better. And I think that's a culture of being a savvy business person to some extent, right? Recognizing that risk is real and my margin is quite small. So the thing that we're talking about right now is it's a little bit distant from, in my imagination, a connection to something practical, useful, and that won't disrupt in a negative way what I've got going on here to make sure that things pencil out. And I think that informs policy. And I think, as you're saying, I think that the way that MDAR in general approaches the sector has that kind of learning and mindset of, it's got to be about removing barriers up front, and being smart about how that gets done. Yeah.
That's great. Thanks, Dave. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about the kind of feedback loops in our realm where we're funding a lot of emerging technologies and emerging markets. We often talk about the kind of feedback loop between the private sector and innovators. And in some sectors, that feedback loop is very rich and robust, and there's this kind of constant dialogue between the private sector entities kind of articulating and identifying their pain points, their challenges, their struggles, sharing that with innovators, and then innovators reacting. And that's how you generate this incredible, pipeline of new ideas and solutions. And I'm wondering if you could kind of, and I think something you said, Julie, made me think that, oh, maybe there is an opportunity for improvement here, that the no-till approach is, yes, some of it is technique, but some of it involves equipment. And I thought I heard you say that not only is that equipment expensive, but there may be an opportunity for some of it to be better or for there to be more options. So, what might that look like? Should we be putting forth a challenge to innovators to come up with better, more cost-effective, higher performing no-till equipment? Are there other areas where there are challenges that farmers have, either just straight up challenges related to their day-to-day businesses or business operation, or challenges that are specific to a changing climate, where maybe there's an opportunity to better articulate those challenges to relevant innovators and do something to kind of improve the robustness and the excitement around that kind of a feedback loop.
Yeah, and 100%. And one of the things, as Dave is describing, the loss of farmland over the last 20 years, what's come with that is a loss of equipment dealerships. So a lot of them have moved to New York and Pennsylvania. So if you talk to farmers around here and you say, you should really try doing some no-till, like they can't find equipment, within a 4-hour drive. And that's a big investment in time and trialing things out. So I would say that yeah, there's a real opportunity there. And I collaborate a lot with Lincoln Fishman at Momentum Ag, who's doing trials around no-till and strip-till. And one of the main things that we come across is farmers who say, like, well, I bought this thing off the shelf, and what I really need is to tweak it in this way to make it work. Or I need it to be 3 rows instead of 2 rows. And that kind of collaboration is really hard to come by. The expertise of people who can modify equipment, there isn't enough of it here. And so I would say I definitely see a real lack of that feedback loop between farmers and that type of tech sector. But there are a lot of other issues, and I think that part of it, I mean, not to be too cynical, but I think with such small margins and just describing, the percentage of our state GDP that agriculture constitutes, I think it's not the most lucrative market. So one of my worries is that there isn't that relationship, right? Because it's just not as fruitful for investors. And I think, my hope is that we can find ways to invest in farms where, because we see their value in terms of the environmental contributions, the ecosystem function that they provide to our society, and to our goal of producing 30% of our food regionally in the next, what is it, 15 years, 20 years?
Yeah.
I would say that one of the things that I'm excited about is AFT has been hosting these, we call them No More Normal conversations with farmers, where we invite farmers to sit and talk amongst farmers, and we invite other people to come listen, but not talk too much. So we invite, everyone, folks from MDAR, from the Natural Resources Conservation Service, from fertilizer dealerships, to just come and listen to what kind of climate impacts farmers are experiencing. And those farmers then share their strategies for dealing with those problems amongst each other. And I think that that's one way that we're trying to increase feedback loop between what farmers are experiencing. They're often like sort of socially isolated, right? They're working 80 hours a week on their farms. They're not running around having inspiring business meetings. So I think that we can also find ways to listen to farmers and to figure out more what they need.
Yeah, and thank you for mentioning that last piece, Julie. I had planned to mention that as well, but of course, I think what you hear a lot from folks like Richard Florida and others, you've got this bump factor, in urban areas where you've got innovators bumping into mentors and investors and serial entrepreneurs and so on and so forth. And in that environment, it's almost, innovation is kind of an automatic byproduct. But yes, farmers are isolated by definition. So it's not surprising that the feedback loops and the ability to connect with entrepreneurs and innovators would be more challenging and fewer and far between. Well, this is great. Oh, and I really appreciate too the reference to momentum. I think Dave, you were definitely the first person to flag them for me, and that is a really exciting effort and organization. It's somewhat reminiscent, I think, of our Innovate Mass program, where we connect innovators with demonstration site partners, and this to me feels like kind of the equivalent in the agricultural realm. So I'm really excited to connect with more with momentum going forward. So let's pivot a little bit to policy. We obviously have a very new and I suspect suboptimal policy environment at the federal level now. Or do we? How do you see farming policy changing at the federal level, and how do you think it'll impact Massachusetts farms? Are there one or two examples that come to mind? And are there some areas of kind of more forward-thinking or climate-oriented farming policy that you think might actually gain bipartisan support? And either of you are, if you have any thoughts. If you don't, we'll move on to the next question. But
I mean, I've definitely, there's no good answers here, but I would say my general impression is that this administration knows it can't abandon farmers, right? But support will be couched more in terms of viability and disaster response in comparison to sustainability or climate adaptation or mitigation. And I think the federal government is going to leave it to the states to do more of that conservation work. But I'm really concerned. We've already seen cuts to like the conservation innovation grant funding through the USDA NRCS, which is something that my organization counts on to run all the programs that I've mentioned. Our farmer-led innovations program has been funded through conservation innovation grants, and there aren't any out there for 2025-26. So that's a real concern. And then I think there's also threats to like regional conservation partnership programs and other things that are just really important in terms of building the capacity of farmers and those of us who support farmers. And then there's the Farm Bill, which I don't think it's beyond the scope of my expertise, but I think it's a really important chance to support farmers and food systems in responding to climate change and all of these other challenges. And I think that there's some real, concerns about how that's being negotiated now.
Anything you want to add to that, Dave? Or
Just briefly, because policy and federal policy specifically is not really my lane, but I'll just echo what I think I've seen in some local news cycles, which is consistency is a kind of key issue. We've seen some things that have changed, but only for a brief period of time, and that really that stirred up a lot in the farming community, in particular with projects that were resting on funds for renewable energy projects, and even a window of 4 months of delay can be really, really tough. But that really just funnels into sort of a wish list. But on the other side, another hope, I suppose, is to again return focus to the sort of snapshot of crisis of farmland and farmland disappearing. Hopefully, the funds for protecting farmland can be institutionalized. I think that would be, it's sort of a foundational element to what we're talking about. And climate impacts won't have any impact if there aren't simply put farms to be an impact on, which is a strange way to say that sort of thing. But that's where my mind goes thinking about that, the intersection of federal policy, federal funds, and state work, and things that are, I think, of paramount importance.
I did note Julie, I also ran across that USDA program, and I thought that looked wonderful. Actually, I had been unaware of it, and it looked like a really exemplary program. This is one supporting kind of innovation on farms. So that is really unfortunate. It's also the type of program that Massachusetts awardees would have been eligible for matching funds from MassCEC in many cases, eligible for under our Amplify Mass program, which provides matching funds for Massachusetts entities seeking federal support for climate-related innovations. So yeah, that's unfortunate. We talked quite a bit about no-till, so I certainly would invite you, Julie, if you want to add anything more about no-till. But I did want to just touch on a couple of hot topics as we round out our time here. Agrivoltaics, I know that UMass Amherst has developed some real expertise around this. I've seen a few farms adopt it, both livestock and vegetable farms in the state, which is kind of interesting. So we'd just love to invite either or both of you to kind of weigh in on either of those topics. Kind of quick hits if you have anything to add or reactions to those topics.
Yeah. I've been collaborating with UMass on this 5-year research project funded by the U.S. Department of Energy on agrivoltaics in Massachusetts. So I've definitely, this is the practice of simultaneously using land for ag production and solar power production. And, I would say that it's been an idea for quite a while, and then the practice of it is fairly new. We're just starting to see data from actual farming systems, and it's really good for some crops. We've seen a lot of successes in the grazing world, especially sheep, and that's really exciting. And I think a lot of folks who are working on more annual production vegetables are still having to really experiment and figure out what crops really fit in that system. And we're also seeing that there are, solar arrays are not all the same. They're really different. So there are arrays that have tracking systems where they're maximizing the amount of light that's captured by the panels, double-sided panels, which are absorbing a lot more light, which seem to be much more effective. And those tracking arrays are much better too, because if there's a critical period of time where your crop needs maximum sun, or say it's been cloudy for a week and you can't afford to have the panels interfering with any light penetration, you can actually tilt them up and make them vertical so that your crop gets maximum light
Interesting.
So the specific technologies of those arrays is evolving, and I think American Farmland Trust has this smart solar program that's working really hard to sort of see what rises to the top in terms of those technologies.
And to be clear there, we're talking about when you talk about kind of which crops make sense, there's a shade tolerance issue. But then, of course, for the farmer, there's an upside, financially, right? They're reducing their energy costs. So it's, maybe there's a little bit of a trade-off. Maybe there's an impact on crop yields. Maybe for some crops, there's an increase in crop yields. So I think that's why I find them interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think
And Dave,
it's
anything to
like
add?
it's a great example of innovation, right? You're going to put what on what and expect it to work, and well, let's see, right? And then as Julie is sort of laying out the evolution of that, right? Don't necessarily concretize your idea about what it is or should be. Follow the information. Like, what are the results? How does it look? But another interesting case example in respect to what it offers the farm. We talked a lot about economic viability, and I think there's a it could potentially answer a piece of that puzzle for certain farms as well. But it's an interesting case study for sure. And I think it is still very much the situation of sample sizes of one for pros and cons. So it's really tough. But I think things will emerge. So blueberry bushes, 50% yield. Leafy greens does great during a drought season. We've got this extra shading, so maybe. So I think those need to filter through, but also the feedback loops that we're talking about continue to inform what the basic infrastructure looks like, what operating underneath it looks like, and letting some of that dust settle. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Yeah, and it does seem like, to just one last thought, is that it does offer sort of a type of crop insurance, right? Like you're still getting your solar crop if your other crops fail. And I think that there's this really false idea among the general public that crop insurance protects all farmers. And it's not true. It's very specific. It works really well for commodity crops. It works well for certain other crops, but I would say most farmers in the state are not able to take advantage of crop insurance. And so that idea of using agrivoltaics as sort of a way to like have a steady income
Yeah.
is really appealing to a lot of people.
Well, and that is certainly my sense of how many farmers in the Midwest view wind power,
Mhm.
right? It's an additional kind of revenue stream or an insurance against those kind of weaker, more difficult years. That's interesting. So maybe I do want to pivot to the questions, but I want to touch on one other issue, which I think is somewhat two related issues. One, very topical, is the recent win by Mamdani in the New York City mayoral primary. I think very interesting that a candidate won who, one of the major emphases, one of his major campaign platform planks was running on this notion of um, public grocery stores, and which is something that I think first emerged in Latin America. But this also somewhat relates to this regional goal that the New England states have to produce a lot more food regionally. I believe the goal is I think we've referenced a couple times now obliquely, but 30% of our food production I believe it's by 2030 or 2035, perhaps.
I hope it's 2035. We need some
Yeah, I
time.
hope it's 2035. And this seems like a very ambitious goal. So I kind of invite you both to kind of weigh in on maybe an observation if you want to go there about the win, the Mamdani win in New York. Um, and because I think that's an interesting signal that someone who ran on a very progressive food policy issue won the New York City mayoral primary. But on this idea of a regional food production target, how are we going to get there? What do we need? What kind of policy frameworks do we need? What kind of supports do farmers need? Because again, it seems like a really big challenge.
Yeah, big question. This is also like not my area of expertise, so I might just say that issues of food security and farm security are intertwined, obviously. And I think that where we can achieve both of those goals simultaneously is really important. I think farmers often feel, I think we see a lot of issues around food scarcity, and then we also hear a lot from farmers saying that they have sort of a fickle population, that people, if strawberries are cheaper from California, people buy them from California, and they want strawberries all year round. And then when their strawberries are in, they don't get them because they're kind of tired because they ate them from California all winter. So like farmers have a lot of examples of how they wish the community was more committed to them in terms of purchasing. And so I don't have any answers, but sorry about that. I would say that there is there was this environmental bond filed by Governor Healy's office this week called the Mass Ready Act. It's a huge environmental investment I think it's like 2.9 billion that covers infrastructure, investing in local economies, including local food and local seafood, and helping communities prepare for climate change. And all of those things are wrapped into this one environmental bond bill. So that's something that I hopeful about.
Great. Thanks, Julie. Dave, you want to jump in on that topic at all, the regional objective?
Oh, I'm sorry, Galen, if that was directed to me. Am I audible? I lost Zoom, but it came right back.
You are, yeah. No, I actually had a
Great.
little bit of a technical glitch myself, I noticed, but I think we're back now, hopefully. Yeah.
Now, and I suppose if there's a joke, I was fortunate that Julie was taking the first pass at that one to try to give me some more, and that it was what it was doing was giving me a little more time. And then when Zoom shut down, it's like, wow, the universe is giving me even more time to try to distill thought. But I don't have anything distilled or maybe even that articulate. But just going back to what you were originally posing, and then maybe you could just give me a refresher on some amendment to it. But I maybe it's not that surprising about voters voting in that way for something quite so fundamental as food, right? I mean, when you strip it all away, it's pretty basic, right? It is a very much a need. And I started to spin a little bit in my mind, just thinking about the way that you opened the call to, thinking about tree coverage. About going back 22,000 years ago to 14,000 years ago, there was a mile of ice over this area. There were not trees, and in fact, it was scraped down to bedrock. The Cape looks like it does for a particular reason. Walden Pond is there for a particular reason. Drumlin Farm is a drumlin for a particular reason. So I think, with the arc of our conversation today, I think if we're going to be innovative, we need to focus on those fundamentals, things that are not nice to haves or whatever else, but are clear wants. Everyone can get behind it. And then really uniform efforts to boost social capital, to be able to communicate clearly to other people and not instantly jump to criticism, but also to be very frank about things that aren't going to work and why, and be able to have meaningful dialogue with people to understand what is fundamental, why it's fundamental, what problems are, and what solutions can be. So not really that useful for I think the way to point toward anything specific, but that's where my mind went.
I think you're bringing us home in a really good way, Dave, with some real talk about how we need to move forward with informed dialogue with integrity on this topic. So I do have a couple. Thanks for that. I do have a couple questions here. I'm actually going to pose one from one of our team members here, my colleague Jim. I think it's a great question. And it relates to, I won't read it in its entirety, but it relates to this notion of do farmers understand kind of their own GHG breakdown on their farms? Are there programs or assistance that are available to farmers to help them understand what are the different components of emissions on farms, and therefore what should they address first, and are there resources to address those? So is that something that's kind of like commonly understood within the farming community? Does the state do anything to help farmers understand that? What's the low-hanging fruit? Sorry again for apologies for the farming related metaphors, but how do we help farmers figure out what to address first?
I think my quick answer would be I think as many farmers would know those numbers and seek out tools as would anybody for their own household or apartment, right? And some people do, and I'm probably at 11 metric tons carbon dioxide equivalent for our household. A lot of that's air travel, but I'm probably an edge case, right? Maybe more useful. I think there was or is a federal program called COMET for trying to calculate some of the emissions based on one's operation. I think a lot of work has been done for dairy in particular. And another sort of general comment, when I think about this space, and there is some nascent scratching of this surface, but actually before I get there, then there's also the type of farmer that will call and make sure that they get through to express fledgling ideas about what carbon sequestration could look like. Here are my numbers. Here's why it's important. Where's the state policy? So there's certainly folks out there in the community that are eager, interested, knowledgeable, or just have an appetite for sure. And in terms of policy and innovation, when I think about this space, I'd want there to be a clear connection before there was any state policy committing farmers to try to move in an involuntary space to run that kind of a calculation, with a clear picture of how barriers were going to be removed to do that, but also how that would nest inside a set of solutions and benefit that come back to the farm. And I'll leave it there for now, I suppose.
And
Thanks. That's helpful.
Yeah, there is a Massachusetts Farm Energy Program, which has several different types of energy audits. Some are available through the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and some are just through MDAR, and they cost different amounts and have a different focus on like utilities or like renewable energy. But say that a lot of those audits are actually hard to get access to for farmers. So there are opportunities there to improve things. And of course, farmers are paying for a lot of the carbon-based energy they're using. So I would say that they do notice. They are noticing and paying attention.
That's right. Actually, that's a very good segue, and I'm going to try and fit in very quickly 2 quick final questions. Yeah, a lot of diesel, right? Are we going to see electric John Deere tractors anytime? Like, are we seeing electrification of farming equipment? Or do they face the same challenge that we see with kind of other large, medium and heavy duty electric vehicles?
I think there's some similar technology challenges there. The horsepower required to drive a sort of general working tractor is just too demanding. We do, right now we're seeing maybe 2 different electric cultivating tractors around in New England. There's a new one that actually in Vermont yesterday and today, farmers were trying that out, built by Tillmore. But like those are generally just the smaller cultivating tractors. And yeah, horsepower is hard to electrify.
And the duty cycle, I suspect, is challenging too. A lot of them are running many, many hours.
Right. Right.
So there's one additional question here, which I think is very interesting. It's probably, we don't really have time for it, but I'm going to pose it anyway, because I think it's really interesting that, of course, the pandemic had all of these impacts on our economy, our culture, the way we work. I'm wondering if you could just both of you quickly weigh in on how the pandemic impacted farmers. I think there was an increase more in buy local, supporting local businesses. One would think there'd be an upside there, but did you see anything else, both short-term and perhaps longer-lasting impacts of the pandemic on farming?
I'll defer to Julie, but my career in farming is a little short-lived. So it was actually after the pandemic that it kicked in. But anecdotally, without mentioning names, I mean, some of the larger operations that had cold storage were critical anchors for communities and beyond when supply chains were disrupted. And I mean, CSA shares went through the roof for a lot of different operators. And at that time, some of the networks I were involved with, people were making, cautious flip statements of the pandemic was the best thing that ever happened for the bottom line, because of people being driven to find local food in an interesting set of circumstances. And I think there was also a lot of learning that emerged from that too, that focused on some of the key issues of farm viability. But yeah, I'll leave it there.
Yeah, and I think farmers who had a direct relationship with their customers were the ones who really benefited, right? CSAs, people who owned farm stores. I definitely heard from wholesale farms they didn't experience the same boost. And I mean, one of the interesting things that I've heard anecdotally is farmers sharing that they developed closer relationships with customers during that time, and that subsequently, when floods have hit or, frost has damaged their fruit crop, the community has stepped up in a really different way. So I've started to see those community relationships as as a form of climate resilience, because they're people who care about keeping your farm afloat in those really critical times.
Well, that is wonderful. We're going to have to close it out here, but I think that was a fascinating conversation. I really enjoyed talking to both of you, Julie and Dave. This is really great. I want to thank everyone who tuned in today. And it's been really fun. Thank you so much for your time and sharing
Thanks,
your
Leon.
insights.
It was great.
Great.
All right. Take
Take
care,
care.
all. See you next time.